Welcome to the debate. You are listening to the WeCyberYou Unlocked podcast. And before we jump into things today, please follow the channel and ask yourself, have you visited WeCyberYou.com recently? Go check it out for more content just like this.
Yes, definitely head over to WeCyberYou.com. Lots of great stuff there.
Absolutely. So let's set the stage for today. Imagine your company gets hit by a massive ransomware attack. It is, 2 in the morning.
Because it is always 2 in the morning.
Always. Your primary servers are completely locked, your backups are encrypted, customer portals are totally offline, and millions of dollars are just vanishing by the minute. In that moment of absolute panic, what actually saves your organization?
Right, the ultimate executive nightmare.
Is it a meticulously engineered, mathematically calculated recovery metric? Or is it a group of employees in a room with a whiteboard, a personal cell phone, and the ability to organically adapt to total chaos?
That scenario perfectly frames our discussion today, which is grounded in our source material, ISO 22301. For anyone deep into operations but maybe new to this specific terminology, this is the international standard for business continuity management systems.
A mouthful, but important.
Yeah, it really is. Essentially, it is the global blueprint designed to ensure an organization can take a massive punch, absorb the shock, and just keep critical operations running.
And the central question we are exploring today is where the true value of that blueprint actually lies. Does it come from its strict, quantifiable planning structures, like the rigid math of impact analysis and recovery timelines?
Or does relying on predefined metrics risk creating a dangerous false sense of security, making the standards mandate for dynamic testing and, adaptive manual workarounds the only real measure of survival?
Right, so I am taking the position that ISO 22301's rigid, quantifiable frameworks are the indispensable bedrock of business survival. They are what transform a vague, feel-good concept of resilience into a measurable, actionable reality.
And I am taking the exact opposite stance. I argue that strict, predefined metrics look really flawless on paper, but they are inherently fragile in unpredictable crises. True resilience stems almost entirely from the standard's demand for continuous testing and the messy, human ability to execute manual workarounds.
I hear you, but without that math, you are just guessing.
Math is great, but I think that mathematical certainty is honestly just a security blanket for executives. When a real crisis hits, your metrics just go out the window, and survival becomes entirely organic.
A security blanket. Okay, let me explain exactly why I think that rigid framework is crucial, rather than just something to help the C-suite sleep at night.
Please do.
If we look at the modern landscape of disruptions the source material outlines, we are not just talking about a localized power outage anymore. We are talking about deep global dependencies, like a single software update can crash millions of machines worldwide.
Right, we've definitely seen that.
A targeted cyber attack can freeze a massive supply chain. We live in an era of always-on digital services. The text is totally unyielding on this point. Downtime is simply no longer an acceptable outcome.
Oh, I completely agree on the stakes. The era of the casual system outage is totally over.
Right. So to meet those stakes, ISO 22301 shifts the paradigm. It moves us from reactive, panicked disaster recovery to total, engineered organizational resilience. And it does this through a really rigorous approach. It mandates a business impact analysis to mathematically identify what must never stop. By defining strict recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives, the standard removes the guesswork from a crisis. It replaces panic with an engineered incident response structure. Without that rigid quantification, how does leadership even know what they're trying to save?
Well, this structure definitely provides comfort. I will give you that. But let me push back on how it actually plays out in reality, because the text itself warns us with a really critical phrase. It says the question is when, not if, a disruption will occur.
Sure.
Heavily structured compliance models inherently assume that crises are predictable enough to be mapped out in advance. My argument is that if you rigidly follow a preset map during an unprecedented disaster, you're just going to walk right off a cliff.
Okay, but
The standard's true power lives in the messy human elements. Specifically, the source material points to the necessity of manual workarounds, simulations and drills, and continuous improvement. I mean, a predefined recovery metric means absolutely nothing if a complex cyber attack encrypts the very operational systems you meticulously plan to restore.
I think we need to look closer at the foundation of that mathematical approach to understand why the map, as you call it, is so vital. Let's dig into the business impact analysis, or the BIA. To understand the tension between structure and adaptability, we really have to break down this planning phase.
All right, let's look at the BI.
Think of a massive cargo ship that suddenly starts taking on water. You do not just organically adapt and have the crew run around with little buckets. You have to make immediate, brutal decisions. Do we seal the engine room to maintain propulsion, even if it means letting the lower cargo hold completely flood?
That is a great visual. You are forced to triage.
Exactly. You triage. And ISO 22301 forces an organization to do exactly this before the water ever breaches the hull. A BI requires every department to assess the financial, operational, and reputational impacts of a disruption over time.
Right.
If the payment gateway goes down for 1 hour, maybe it costs $10,000. If it is down for 24 hours, maybe it costs $2 million and triggers huge regulatory fines. The BI forces leadership to draw a line in the sand and explicitly define the critical business functions.
I understand the logic, but without the BIA linking specific risks to defined business continuity strategies, your crisis response is just uncoordinated panic. You are basically trying to save the cargo while the engine's drowned.
Wait, let me make sure I am getting your point here. You are saying the BIA acts as those watertight doors, ensuring everyone knows what to protect first.
Yes.
Okay, but what happens when the water's not coming from a single hole in the hull? What if you were dealing with a massive, cascading supply chain breakdown where all the compartments are failing at once? My concern is that predefining what functions are critical creates a really dangerous tunnel vision.
Tunnel vision? How so? Because you are planning in a sterile environment. Let's say your BIA designates your automated logistics platform as the absolute most critical function. During a crisis, the framework dictates you pour all your resources into restoring it. But what if the disruption is a fundamental vulnerability in that platform's code?
Well, you still need to...
The rigid plan says restore the platform, but doing so just replicates the failure. Doesn't rigid adherence to a BIA risk blinding leadership to alternative operational pathways that simply were not deemed critical during the planning phase? They are staring at a broken system instead of pivoting.
I see why you might think it creates tunnel vision, but I would argue it actually provides clarity when vision is completely obscured by the fog of war. The BIA is not an anchor tying you to a sinking ship. It is a compass.
A compass pointing to a broken system.
No, it tells you what capability you need to maintain, not necessarily the specific technological manifestation of it. If the logistics platform is critical, the BIA tells you that moving goods is the priority.
But if the compass is pointing toward a mirrored server environment that is also infected with ransomware, aren't you just efficiently walking off that cliff I mentioned earlier?
Not if you actually follow the mechanisms of recovery dictated by the standard. And this naturally brings us to RTO and RPO, recovery time objective and recovery point objective. Once the BIA defines what is critical, these metrics dictate exactly how fast it must return and with how much allowable data loss. If you're an IT director listening to this, you live and breathe these acronyms.
Oh, and you probably lose sleep over them too.
Ha, fair enough. But I champion RTO and RPO as the definitive mechanisms of survival. Let's look at the source materials example. If you determine your business can only tolerate losing 4 hours of data, well, that is your RPO. You do not just write that down and hope for the best.
Right. It drives the architecture.
Exactly. That math forces you to engineer your systems to meet the target. It forces you to maintain continuous encrypted backups. If your RTO, your downtime limit, is 2 hours, that forces you to build active server clusters in different geographic regions. The quantifiable goal literally builds the structural redundancy. That mathematical recovery is what keeps the business alive when a region goes dark.
I hear that, but I think we need to look at how these metrics behave in the wild. Let me offer a different analogy. Strict RTOs are like a meticulously planned, beautifully engineered train schedule.
Okay.
It is a brilliant piece of logistics. right up until the moment a flood washes the train tracks completely away. At that point, you don't need a better schedule, and you don't need a stopwatch to measure how late the train is. You need an off-road vehicle.
But building a parallel track takes time and money. How do you even know if it is worth the investment without the RTO dictating it in the first place?
The problem is that redundancy is often just duplication. And in modern cyber disruptions, duplicating your infrastructure often means duplicating your vulnerability. Let's dig into the mechanism of a modern ransomware attack. Threat actors do not just break in and encrypt things immediately.
Right, the dwell time.
Exactly. They dwell in the network for months. They systematically hunt down your backups. They alter the encryption keys, so your structural plan says, we have a 4-hour RPO, restore from the encrypted backup. But the reality is, the backup is toxic. You are restoring a bomb.
Well,
If your primary network and your backups are compromised, your predetermined RTO is instantly rendered mathematically impossible. If leadership is obsessing over the metric, they're losing the business.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the organization just freezes when the metric fails. You're acting like ISO 22301 ignores the possibility of total failure. The standard explicitly requires strategies for when the primary plans are compromised. If the tracks wash away, an ISO 22301 compliant organization already has alternative suppliers on standby.
But that is exactly my point. The tech's emphasis on alternative suppliers and manual workarounds is where the actual survival happens. A manual workaround is the complete antithesis of a measurable, automated IT recovery.
I wouldn't call it the antithesis.
It is people using whiteboards, pen and paper, and personal cell phones to coordinate shipping routes because the network is gone. You cannot easily assign a strict RTO to human improvisation. By arguing that the value of the standard lies in its quantifiable metrics, you diminish the incredible resilience found in its requirement for manual adaptability. Adaptability is chaotic. It defies strict quantification.
I am not dismissing manual workarounds. I just argue they are a localized tactic within a highly structured overarching strategy. You say adaptability defies quantification, but without a framework, manual workarounds are just rogue employees doing whatever they want.
Sometimes rogue employees save the company.
But the standard gives you a strict framework for managing that chaos. To really understand this, we have to move this theoretical debate into its ultimate crucible, cybersecurity and incident response.
Oh, this is definitely where the theoretical planning hits the brick wall of reality.
Exactly. The source text lays out a really brilliant architectural relationship between three major standards. Let's break this down simply. We have ISO 31000, which is risk management. Think of that as your weather radar telling you a Category 5 hurricane is offshore.
Okay.
Then we have ISO 27001, which deals with information security controls. That is you boarding up the windows and locking the doors. But what happens when someone just drives a truck through the front of the building?
The security controls fail.
Yes. The text acknowledges a harsh reality. Even the best security can fail. When a ransomware worm bypasses your deadbolt and encrypts your systems, 31000 and 27001 are essentially done. That is where ISO 22301 steps in as the incident response structure.
Right, to manage the fallout.
It provides defined roles, crisis communication plans, and escalation procedures. It guarantees fast, coordinated action. Think about the fog of war during a cyber attack. Without this standard, you have paralyzed executives arguing in a conference room while the company bleeds out. With ISO 22301, everyone knows exactly who has the authority to declare a disaster, who isolates the network, and who speaks to the media. That structural certainty is the only thing preventing total collapse.
You are absolutely right that ISO 27001 will eventually fail. The controls will be breached. But I use that exact fact to prove that static controls and predefined procedures are ultimately insufficient. On their own, let's look at a golden rule from the text. I actually think it is the most important concept in the entire document.
Which is?
Plans are only useful if they actually work under pressure.
Oh, I completely agree with that. A plan sitting on a shelf is totally useless.
But think about the mechanism of how plans fail in practice. The standard is a certifiable document. You can hire an auditor to review your escalation procedures and your defined roles, and they will give you a nice, shiny piece of paper saying you meet the standard.
Right.
But that certificate is secondary to survival. The true value of ISO 22301 isn't in having an escalation procedure beautifully formatted in a binder. The value is in the mandate for simulations and drills.
Because the drills validate the structure.
No, because the drills expose how fragile the structure actually is. When you run a tabletop exercise of a severe cyber attack, you almost always find that the defined roles break down immediately. The person assigned to communicate with the media is, on a flight over the Atlantic.
Well,
The escalation procedure requires 3 levels of executive approval, which is completely useless against a self-propagating ransomware worm that infects 1,000 servers a minute. The true value of the standard is the continuous improvement forced by the failure of the plan during testing.
that is a fair challenge. But let me reframe that a bit. Have you considered that you cannot effectively test something that hasn't been rigorously defined first?
How do you mean?
The simulations and drills only have value because they are testing the limits of a highly structured system. You need the baseline. You need the RTOs, the RPOs, the BIA, and those defined roles to measure your performance against.
Okay, I see where you're going.
If you just throw a chaotic scenario at a business without an ISO 22301 framework in place, you do not get continuous improvement. You just get failure. You get people yelling at each other. The rigid structure is what allows the organization to systematically learn, isolate the bottleneck, and update the plan.
I agree that a baseline is necessary to start the conversation, but the danger is falling in love with the baseline. Let me bring us back to the reality of those toxic backups we discussed earlier.
Sure.
The organizations that survive those catastrophic events are not the ones who strictly follow the predefined escalation procedure while staring at a locked server. They're the ones who have built a culture of adaptability through rigorous, painful drills. They immediately recognize the plan is dead. They abandon the compromised IT recovery plan and pivot instantly to alternative suppliers or manual operations. The standard's emphasis on resilience, not just prevention, is a mandate for agility, not just better documentation.
I hear what you were saying, but abandoning a plan still requires a framework for making that massive decision. Pivoting to manual operations across a global enterprise is a monumental shift. ISO 22301 provides the crisis communication plans that allow leadership to actually execute that pivot. It gives you the authority to say the digital systems are gone, move to paper. It provides the structure for the adaptation itself.
It gives permission, perhaps, but the execution is all human ingenuity.
Well, let's look at the areas where our perspectives clearly align, because I think despite our different framing of the mechanics, we're actually looking at the exact same end goal here.
Yeah, I think we definitely agree on the source text's core thesis. In today's environment of highly integrated global supply chains, always-on digital services, and escalating cyber threats, downtime is simply unacceptable. You cannot just tell your customers to check back on Monday.
Exactly. And we both clearly recognize the profound shift this standard represents. It forces an organization to move away from mere prevention, which we both agree will inevitably fail at some point, to guaranteed business survival. The capacity to absorb a massive, unexpected shock and continue delivering products and services is the true hallmark of a modern, mature organization.
Absolutely. And whether you view that survival as the ultimate result of impeccable mathematical planning or as the result of relentless, chaotic drilling and human adaptability, the mandate from the text is clear. Organizations must be resilient, prepared, and adaptive. You really cannot have one without the other, even if we fundamentally disagree on which element ultimately saves the day when the screens go dark.
Right. To summarize my perspective, I maintain that true organizational resilience absolutely requires the quantifiable measurements and defined escalation procedures provided by ISO 22301. The business impact analysis and the rigid recovery objectives are the structural steel that ensures an organization has the capacity to survive. They turn good intentions into engineered reality.
And to summarize my view, I believe that while the steel is important, true survival relies on the standard's emphasis on continuous testing, organic adaptation, and manual resilience.
Rigid plans will always encounter unpredictable chaos. It is the flexibility cultivated through simulations and the ability to operate outside the mathematical models that determines if a business actually survives the storm.
The tension between structural planning and dynamic adaptation is not going to resolve itself anytime soon. In fact, as technological disruptions become more frequent, more interconnected, and honestly, far more sophisticated, navigating that tension will only become a more critical skill for leadership. We encourage you to dive deeper into the nuances of business continuity management systems yourself, as exploring these standards will yield even more insights into the mechanics of modern organizational survival.
There is definitely a lot more beneath the surface of these frameworks than just compliance checklist. It is really about the psychology of crisis management.
Building a structure capable of withstanding unprecedented forces requires both the mathematical genius of a rigid blueprint and the life-saving grace of flexible joints. You need the math to build it and the organic sway to keep it standing when the ground actually shifts. Thank you for joining us for this exchange of ideas.